January 1945. The bitter winds of winter whip across the island of Okinawa, where the relentless roar of artillery fire echoes through the dense jungle. American forces, battered and bloodied, are pushing forward, inching closer to their objective, the heart of the Japanese defense. But amid the chaos, amid the carnage of war, there is an unexpected moment of quiet. In a makeshift field hospital, a group of Japanese nurses, their uniforms stained with blood, move with precision and determination, tending to the wounded. Their faces are hardened by the brutal realities of war, yet there is a trace of hope in their eyes, a hope that, perhaps, the battle is nearing its end. Then, as the doors creak open, a new presence enters the room. American soldiers, young men, weary and scarred by their own experiences, step into the chaos of the medical tent. But instead of raising weapons or shouting orders, they do something entirely unexpected. They offer water, gentle hands, and compassion. A nurse flinches at first, instinctively recoiling. But the soldiers, in the quiet moments between the storms of battle, offer only gentleness, a stark contrast to the violence they had been trained to unleash. In the middle of the Pacific Theater, on an island surrounded by the sounds of war, the unlikeliest of bonds begins to form. The nurses, initially shocked, begin to realize something they never expected. These soldiers, their sworn enemies, are treating them with the same care they would give to their own comrades. A silence falls over the room, heavy with the weight of an unspoken truth. The nurses can hardly believe it. These men, who had been painted as monsters, were, in this moment, showing the very qualities they had been taught to despise. The Pacific War, 1944-1945, a time when the world was caught in a maelstrom of destruction, chaos, and suffering. On one side, the mighty Imperial Japanese Army, firm in their belief of their superiority, their culture steeped in militaristic pride. On the other, the American forces, determined, battle-hardened, and driven by a desire to end the war at any cost. For both sides, the stakes were higher than ever before, and the fighting was nothing short of brutal. By early 1945, the United States had secured a foothold in the Pacific after months of bloody island-hopping campaigns. The goal was clear: take strategic islands, destroy the Japanese military, and prepare for the eventual invasion of the Japanese home islands. Iwo Jima had been taken after one of the fiercest battles in the history of warfare, and now Okinawa, the largest of the Ryukyu Islands, was the next target. It was a key stepping stone for the Allied forces, a gateway to Japan itself. On the Japanese side, Okinawa had become the final stronghold. The Imperial Japanese Army, entrenched deeply in the island's rugged terrain, prepared for an all-out defense. The battle for Okinawa would go down in history as one of the bloodiest of the Pacific War. The Japanese were not only defending their island, but also the honor of their emperor and the sacred soil of Japan. But it was not just the soldiers who played a part in this war. Behind the lines, within the makeshift hospitals and field clinics, were the Japanese nurses. These women, many of whom were conscripted into service, worked tirelessly to tend to the wounded, often under fire. The Japanese military had a distinct attitude towards their female nurses, expecting them to endure the same hardships as their male counterparts. They were often seen as an extension of the military itself, trained to be selfless and to serve without question, even as their own lives hung in the balance. For the American soldiers, the Pacific was a war unlike any other. The enemy was faceless. No front lines to speak of, just jungles, beaches, and caves. The Japanese were painted as fanatical, willing to fight to the death rather than surrender. The Americans were told to expect cruelty, to prepare for atrocities. The propaganda machine on both sides created a narrative of dehumanization, turning soldiers into mere extensions of their nations rather than individuals with their own personalities, fears, and vulnerabilities. As the battle for Okinawa raged, American soldiers were prepared for the worst. They had seen atrocities committed by the Japanese, heard of the horrors inflicted on prisoners of war, and were steeled for the brutal reality of the conflict. In many ways, they were the embodiment of the anger and resentment that had built up over years of war. Yet, in the midst of this hatred, there were moments of humanity, moments that neither side could have foreseen. It was within this framework of cultural differences, entrenched animosity, and years of brutal fighting that the encounter between the American soldiers and the Japanese nurses would unfold. As the war progressed, both sides found themselves entrenched not only in battle, but in deeply ingrained stereotypes about the enemy. For the Japanese, the Americans were a faceless, ruthless force, bent on the destruction of their nation, their way of life. Propaganda painted them as barbarians, invaders from across the ocean who would stop at nothing to crush the spirit of the Japanese people. The Japanese military, particularly under the leadership of the Imperial Army, fostered a culture of absolute loyalty and sacrifice. To surrender was to dishonor oneself and one's family. Death, even in the face of overwhelming odds, was often preferred over capture. On the other hand, American forces, having faced the horrors of war in Europe and the Pacific, viewed the Japanese through a lens of hatred and fear. The image of the enemy was reinforced by the violent nature of their resistance, which often involved suicidal banzai charges and a refusal to yield, even when it meant certain death. The brutal tactics employed by the Japanese military, especially their treatment of prisoners of war, only deepened the animosity felt by American soldiers. In a way, the Japanese soldiers were not men. They were simply obstacles to be removed at all costs. Yet, the reality of war on the ground often shattered these preconceived notions. As American forces advanced through the Pacific, they were forced to confront the human cost of the war. Soldiers and civilians, alike, caught in the brutal crossfire. The American soldiers, whose training had focused on fighting and winning, often found themselves in situations that tested their humanity. The horrific nature of the battles, the mass casualties on both sides, made it impossible to ignore the shared suffering of all involved. Then came the unexpected. During the Battle for Okinawa, as American soldiers fought their way through the island, they began to encounter Japanese nurses, women who had been conscripted to serve the military in hospitals and field units. These nurses, many of whom had trained to be selfless and dedicated to the care of the wounded, found themselves in a war that had taken on a personal and horrific scale. As Japanese military doctors and nurses treated the wounded, they too were caught in the same cycle of destruction, facing constant threat and danger from the relentless American bombardments. What happened next was a stark contrast to everything the American soldiers had been led to expect. In a moment of unexpected tenderness, American soldiers, hardened by months of combat and conditioned to view the Japanese with contempt, came across these nurses and, instead of hostility, extended kindness. Water was offered, wounds were treated, and words of comfort were spoken. The soldiers, who had been conditioned to see the Japanese as a collective enemy, were now faced with individuals, women who had, like them, been caught in the gears of a brutal war. For the Japanese nurses, the encounter was equally shocking. They had been trained to view their American captors as monsters, as brutal invaders who had no respect for life, especially the lives of women. The propaganda they had been fed painted the Americans as ruthless and savage. But now, faced with these same soldiers, they found themselves in the midst of a situation that defied everything they had been taught to believe. These men, whose faces had been demonized in the newspapers, whose voices had been vilified on the radio, were treating them with an unexpected degree of compassion. The cultural divide was immense, but in these moments of care and humanity, something extraordinary began to happen. Both the American soldiers and the Japanese nurses began to see each other not as enemies, but as human beings, caught in a war not of their choosing, struggling to survive. In the chaos of war, there are few moments where humanity is not obscured by the smoke and destruction. But in these fleeting instances, where the raw emotion of the human experience is laid bare, the true nature of individuals can be revealed. For the Japanese nurses caught in the crossfire of the Pacific War, the encounter with American soldiers was a profound and eye-opening experience. Many of these women had been conscripted into service, leaving behind their families and homes. Their lives were no longer their own. They were soldiers in a different form, tasked with the grim responsibility of tending to the wounded, both enemy and ally. But there was more to these nurses than simply their roles in the war. They were women with families, with hopes, with fears. In their eyes, the American soldiers who entered their world were not just the enemy. They were human beings too. However, this humanity had been obscured by the years of war, propaganda, and violence. When the nurses first encountered the American soldiers, it was a moment of shock. These were the men they had been taught to fear, to despise. Yet, as the soldiers offered care, water, and comfort, the nurses could not help but feel an unexpected warmth in their hearts. It was an emotion they had not anticipated, an emotion that contradicted everything they had been told. The sudden realization that their enemy was capable of compassion shook the nurses to their core, forcing them to confront the dehumanizing force of the war. For the American soldiers, the experience was equally disorienting. Many of them had spent months in the Pacific, enduring brutal combat and harsh conditions. The Japanese were an abstraction, an enemy to be defeated, a force to be vanquished. But here, in the midst of battle, these soldiers were faced with individuals whose suffering mirrored their own. The nurses were not faceless enemies. They were human beings, with names, with stories. In those rare moments when American soldiers tended to the Japanese nurses, there was no war, no battle. There was only the simple act of kindness, a reflection of the shared humanity that had been lost in the fog of war. In the broader context of the Pacific War, these moments of unexpected tenderness were not the norm. The tactical environment of the Pacific was one of relentless assault, attrition, and brutality. The American forces were engaged in island-hopping campaigns, seizing strategically important islands and pushing the Japanese back toward their homeland. These battles were characterized by high casualties, savage fighting, and a complete disregard for mercy. The military strategies employed by both sides reflected the dehumanizing nature of the conflict. The Japanese army, deeply entrenched in a culture of sacrifice, would fight to the last man, often resorting to banzai charges in the face of certain defeat. For the Americans, the Pacific theater represented an almost existential struggle, one that demanded complete victory at any cost. The brutality of these engagements left little room for the niceties of compassion. Soldiers on both sides were trained to see the enemy as an obstacle, a hurdle to be overcome. Yet, despite the tactical realities of the war, these moments of compassion between soldiers and nurses demonstrate an interesting paradox. The soldiers were not operating as ruthless automatons. There was, in fact, a significant degree of humanity in their actions. The tactical aim of the war, to defeat the enemy and secure victory, was still at the forefront. But these encounters, brief as they were, forced a reconsideration of what war truly meant. The nurses, though enemies in the eyes of the soldiers, were not just targets to be neutralized. They were individuals caught in the same war, with the same hopes of survival. In these rare instances, the tactical environment was temporarily transformed. The hospital tents, the makeshift medical stations, became places where the rules of warfare, the cold calculations of enemy and ally, were suspended. There, amidst the carnage of battle, the soldiers and nurses were able to see one another not as enemies, but as human beings who had been swept up in the same tide of destruction. While the personal and tactical aspects of war are often the most compelling, technology also played a significant role in shaping the way soldiers and nurses interacted during the war. In the case of the Pacific, both sides utilized advanced, for the time, medical technology to care for the wounded, often under the most harrowing of conditions. The Japanese military had developed a system of field hospitals to treat the wounded. Though their resources were often limited, Japanese nurses were tasked with caring for soldiers who had suffered grave injuries, sometimes without adequate medical supplies or equipment. The conditions were primitive, with the nurses working in cramped, unsanitary environments, often under constant threat of airstrikes or artillery fire. The nurses themselves were often forced to endure physical and emotional strain as they worked tirelessly to save lives, even as their own safety was compromised. For the American soldiers, medical technology was a different story. The U.S. military had access to a more sophisticated system of medical care, including mobile field hospitals and a wider range of medical supplies. American medics and doctors were trained in advanced techniques for treating battlefield injuries, often under the most extreme circumstances. The contrast in the medical resources available to both sides was stark. While the Japanese nurses were often working with limited tools, the American soldiers had access to the latest medical technologies. In the field hospitals, the technology, bandages, antiseptics, antibiotics, allowed American soldiers to treat the Japanese wounded with an efficiency that was not available to the nurses in their own facilities. And when American soldiers tended to the Japanese nurses, they did so with access to the same medical care that had been given to their comrades. This stark contrast in medical resources added another layer to the complex relationship between soldiers and nurses. While both sides were struggling to treat the wounded, the quality of care and the resources available influenced the nature of their interactions. These technological differences also served as a reminder of the larger conflict, the war not just between two armies, but between two worlds. The American soldiers, with their advanced medical systems, were positioned as the benefactors in this brief moment of humanity. Their technology, meant to heal, was now an instrument of peace, at least for a fleeting moment. War is often driven by the decisions of leaders, their strategies, orders, and visions for victory. However, the leadership displayed on the ground in moments of individual interaction can also have a profound impact on the course of events. In the Pacific Theater, American military leadership, while focused on achieving tactical victory, placed great emphasis on maintaining discipline and treating prisoners of war in accordance with international law. Though this was not always perfectly executed, there were notable instances where American commanders encouraged humane treatment of captives, regardless of nationality. One such leader was General Simon Bolivar Buckner, the American commander during the Battle of Okinawa. Buckner, known for his professionalism and commitment to his soldiers, emphasized a code of conduct that urged his men to treat prisoners with dignity and respect. Though the realities of battle often clouded these principles, there was a clear directive to treat the wounded, both enemy and American, as humanely as possible. In this context, American soldiers who encountered Japanese nurses found themselves acting not solely out of military protocol, but in accordance with the leadership's guidance, to help, heal, and show restraint when faced with the defeated. On the Japanese side, leadership was marked by a vastly different set of priorities. The Imperial Army's command structure fostered a sense of blind loyalty to the emperor, with little regard for the well-being of individuals, especially those seen as expendable. Japanese nurses, like other personnel in the military, were expected to endure hardship without question. They were trained not only to serve, but to sacrifice, sometimes without the tools, resources, or even the protection they needed. The leadership of the Imperial Army, rather than urging empathy or compassion in their ranks, often reinforced the idea of ultimate loyalty through suffering and death. However, in moments like those during the Battle of Okinawa, the juxtaposition of leadership styles between the two sides became clear. Where the American soldiers, driven by directives to treat the wounded with dignity, extended kindness, the Japanese nurses, also subjected to the unyielding demands of their military leaders, found themselves in a conflict that could not have been more foreign to their expectations. The leadership that led the nurses to endure the suffering of war had not prepared them for this moment of human decency from their enemies. The most striking element of these interactions was the realization on both sides that the enemy was not a faceless mass of evil, but individuals capable of feeling pain, fear, and compassion. The American soldiers had been trained to see the Japanese as the enemy, the personification of everything their country was fighting against. In many ways, they had been taught to dehumanize the enemy in order to make their actions on the battlefield seem justifiable. For the soldiers, the Japanese were often seen as the other, a monolithic force bent on destruction. Yet, when these soldiers came face to face with the nurses, they were forced to confront a far different reality. The nurses, in their humility and vulnerability, represented a facet of the enemy that the soldiers had not been prepared to face. These women were not soldiers of the same caliber as those who fought alongside the soldiers on the battlefield. They were civilians caught in the war's wake, forced to take up arms in the form of medical duty. As the American soldiers provided care to the nurses, it became impossible for them to maintain the psychological distance they had been taught to keep. These nurses, once part of the faceless enemy, were now recognized for their humanity. For the Japanese nurses, the enemy they had been taught to fear and despise became more complicated. These soldiers, the very men who had been painted as monsters, were showing them a kindness they had never anticipated. The nurses, accustomed to being trained in the harshness of the Japanese military system, could hardly reconcile this unexpected gentleness with the image of the American soldier they had been indoctrinated to believe in. The paradox was difficult to comprehend. Could these soldiers really be so different from the images of savagery they had seen in propaganda films and heard about in the reports from home? The kindness they were receiving was not only a physical aid but a psychological one, forcing the nurses to confront the human side of their captors. In the midst of war, moral clarity is often obscured by the fog of violence and survival. The boundary between right and wrong becomes blurred, as soldiers on both sides must make difficult decisions that challenge their ethical principles. Yet, in rare moments like those encountered by the American soldiers and the Japanese nurses, the line between enemy and friend becomes strikingly clear. These moments of compassion transcend the binary of combatants and non-combatants, offering a brief but profound glimpse into the complex moral landscape of war. For the American soldiers, these interactions tested the moral boundaries they had been conditioned to uphold. They had been taught to fight with every ounce of their strength and resolve to defeat the enemy at all costs. Yet, in the midst of battle, they found themselves offering kindness to those they had been taught to hate. This shift, however brief, raised difficult questions. Was this act of compassion a sign of weakness? Or was it a reflection of the soldiers' true strength? Strength not in violence, but in their ability to offer mercy where none was expected. The nurses, in turn, faced their own moral dilemma. Having been raised within a system that demanded ultimate sacrifice and loyalty to the emperor, they had been taught to see the American soldier as the embodiment of evil. Yet, in the moments when they were tended to by these same soldiers, they were forced to reconsider this deeply ingrained belief. In the face of kindness, how could they reconcile their understanding of the enemy with the reality of what they were experiencing? Was this mercy a sign of moral superiority, or was it simply a reflection of the soldiers' shared humanity? Ultimately, these interactions, fleeting though they were, presented a moral crossroads for both sides. The soldiers and the nurses found themselves in a rare position where empathy, not animosity, guided their actions. These brief moments of humanity in the midst of war serve as a testament to the potential for compassion even in the most dehumanizing circumstances. April 1, 1945, the Battle of Okinawa has begun. It is one of the bloodiest campaigns in the Pacific, a brutal clash between the American forces, determined to secure the island as a launch point for the invasion of Japan, and the Imperial Japanese Army, which will fight to the death rather than surrender. The Japanese forces are deeply entrenched, utilizing the island's caves and rugged terrain to their advantage. American soldiers are thrust into this hellscape, struggling to advance inch by inch through heavy artillery fire, sniper attacks, and kamikaze assaults. Okinawa is no ordinary battle. It is an all-out assault on Japanese soil. The American military, having learned from the battles of Iwo Jima and Tarawa, is relentless in their campaign. The soldiers fight in a terrain that is unfamiliar, plagued with constant danger. Yet, amid this hellish atmosphere, the unexpected happens. In the midst of their brutal fighting, the American soldiers encounter Japanese nurses, some wounded, some in the field hospitals, and others who have been captured or forced to tend to the injured. The interaction between the American soldiers and these nurses occurs not in the heat of direct battle, but in the strange, quiet spaces between. After the smoke of battle clears, and the American soldiers move through the areas where the wounded lie, some American, some Japanese, they are faced with an unexpected sight. Japanese nurses, who have been forced into service, now performing the same grim duty as the soldiers themselves. But instead of responding with hostility or indifference, the American soldiers offer something unexpected: kindness. The nurses, still reeling from the brutality of the conflict and the long months of war, are shocked. They had been conditioned to fear and despise the Americans, who were painted as invaders and enemies of their homeland. The nurses had been taught to see the American soldiers as faceless, brutal forces of destruction. Yet now they are met with something entirely different. Water is offered, wounds are bandaged, and comfort is extended, even though these women were, until moments ago, enemies. In the confusion of war, it's as if time stands still for a moment. The soldiers, weary and battle-worn, take a moment to extend a human touch, an act of mercy that cuts through the dehumanization of war. It is not a grand gesture, but one that carries immense significance. For the soldiers, it is an act of decency, of recognizing that despite the hate, there is something more than just combatants on the battlefield. For the nurses, it is an overwhelming shock, a moment that forces them to confront the humanity of those they have long believed to be merciless. In this brief, fleeting instance, both the soldiers and the nurses see beyond the uniforms, beyond the propaganda, and recognize each other for what they are. Individuals caught in a war that neither side truly desired. The intensity of the battle may rage around them, but for a moment, they are simply two groups of people in the middle of an unfathomable tragedy. It was not a dramatic shift in the tide of battle, but it was a pivotal moment nonetheless. The American soldiers, engaged in a war that had demanded everything from them, found themselves at a crossroads of human decency. To offer kindness in the middle of such an intense and unrelenting conflict was an extraordinary act. It wasn't planned. It wasn't premeditated. It was a moment of empathy born from the shared suffering that both sides experienced. For the Japanese nurses, the encounter was a disorienting experience. Many of them had already seen the brutality of war. They had witnessed the deaths of friends, family, and comrades. They had experienced the horrors of battle firsthand. Yet the kindness they received from their enemies was something they had not anticipated. In those moments of shock and disbelief, they realized that the American soldiers were not monsters. They were human beings, capable of empathy and compassion, just as the Japanese soldiers had been. This realization didn't change the war or the reasons behind it, but it shifted something fundamental within them. In that moment, the rigid walls built by propaganda and hatred began to crack. The psychological and emotional shift for both the American soldiers and the Japanese nurses was profound. For the soldiers, these fleeting moments of humanity forced them to confront the reality of their training, how they had been taught to view the Japanese as an undifferentiated, faceless enemy. These nurses, once enemies, had now become individuals who, like them, were caught in the whirlwind of a conflict they could not escape. This encounter planted the seed of doubt in the soldiers' minds about the righteousness of their perceptions and the possibility of empathy beyond the battlefield. For the nurses, the experience was equally transformative. They had been taught to view the American soldiers with the utmost suspicion and fear. But in these moments of tenderness, the narrative they had been fed was shattered. The soldiers they had feared were now seen as people, vulnerable, wounded, and kind. It was an epiphany that would remain with them long after the war had ended. The Battle of Okinawa would ultimately prove to be a victory for the Allied forces, but the emotional impact of the encounter between the American soldiers and the Japanese nurses left an indelible mark on both sides. In a war that had been defined by hatred and bloodshed, these brief moments of humanity reminded both soldiers and nurses that, even in the darkest times, the potential for compassion remained. The Battle of Okinawa, one of the bloodiest confrontations of the Pacific War, ended on June 22, 1945. The Allied forces, having successfully captured the island, now had a strategic foothold from which they could launch their final assault on Japan's home islands. The toll of the battle was immense. American forces suffered over 50,000 casualties, including more than 12,000 dead, while the Japanese lost approximately 110,000 soldiers, with civilians caught in the crossfire. The island itself was left in ruins, a testament to the sheer ferocity of the fighting. But the aftermath of Okinawa did not end on the battlefield. The psychological and emotional scars left by the war, particularly among the soldiers who participated in the battle, would linger for years. The brutal nature of the conflict, the constant threat of death, and the dehumanization that had been central to wartime propaganda began to wear on the soldiers' minds. And yet, within this maelstrom of destruction, moments of unexpected humanity, such as the encounters between the American soldiers and Japanese nurses, served as a brief but significant reminder of the complexity of human emotions and the possibility of compassion even in the most desperate circumstances. For the American soldiers who extended kindness to the Japanese nurses, the emotional impact was deep and lasting. The realization that they were capable of showing mercy to those they had been taught to view as the enemy altered their perception of the war and of the people they were fighting. These brief encounters of compassion did not erase the brutality of the war or the reasons for it, but they provided a glimpse of a more humane side of war, a side that, though fleeting, proved to be just as powerful as the violence. The nurses, too, carried the emotional weight of these encounters with them. Having been raised in a culture that emphasized loyalty, sacrifice, and the demonization of the enemy, their experience with American soldiers who showed them kindness was a transformative one. They had been taught to see the Americans as brutal invaders, yet now they found themselves treated with dignity and compassion in their darkest hour. This unexpected shift in their understanding of the enemy added a layer of complexity to their experience of war, one that would stay with them long after the conflict had ended. In the larger context of the war, these moments of empathy remained isolated. The Pacific War would continue to be defined by violence, propaganda, and dehumanization. The ultimate goal, defeating Japan, was achieved, but the personal transformations that occurred within individuals, like the soldiers and nurses who encountered each other in these fleeting moments, were rarely discussed in the aftermath of the war. The emotional and psychological toll of the war would take years to heal, and the acts of mercy between soldiers and nurses remained a quiet, personal memory for those involved. Despite the overwhelming brutality that marked the Pacific theater, the war did not end with a single act of finality. Instead, it ended with a series of moments, some grand and others intimate, that forever altered the individuals who experienced them. For those who had witnessed the unexpected kindness, whether it was the soldiers or the nurses, the war did not simply end with the fall of Okinawa. It ended with a deeper understanding of the complexities of human nature and the possibility of empathy in the most unlikely of places. The surrender of Japan on August 15, 1945, marked the official end of World War II. The Pacific, once a theater of relentless brutality, now shifted into a period of reconstruction and reflection. For the American soldiers who had fought in Okinawa, the war's end brought a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and reflection. The suffering and destruction they had witnessed would remain with them forever, but there was also a deep sense of pride in their victory. They had fought and survived through some of the most harrowing battles of the war, and now the long-awaited peace had arrived. But peace did not erase the psychological scars left by years of combat. Soldiers who had endured the brutalities of the Pacific Front were left to grapple with the emotional weight of their actions. The brutality of the fighting, the dehumanizing nature of war, and the guilt of having taken lives were issues that many soldiers struggled with long after the war was over. In the quiet moments after battle, when they extended kindness to those they had once seen as enemies, the soldiers began to confront the complexities of war. The soldiers who had encountered Japanese nurses in the heat of battle would carry with them the memory of those fleeting moments of compassion. The emotional shift that had taken place, the realization that their enemies were human too, would stay with them as they tried to return to civilian life. For many, these acts of mercy would become a defining moment of their service, a quiet testament to the possibility of kindness even in the worst of times. The Japanese nurses, too, faced the aftermath of the war in their own way. Many were left to pick up the pieces of their lives after the conflict ended. Having endured the horrors of the battlefield, the nurses returned to a Japan that was left in ruins. The country was deeply wounded, its cities bombed, its economy shattered. The Japanese women who had served in the war were now left to navigate a society that was shifting and rebuilding, while also grappling with their own experiences. For many of the nurses, the war had been an emotional and psychological ordeal that required years of healing. The kindness extended by the American soldiers, unexpected and brief, was something that remained with them as they tried to make sense of their role in the conflict. Some nurses found it difficult to reconcile the compassion they had received with the images of the enemy they had been taught to fear. Others saw the kindness as a symbol of the potential for peace in a world that had been ravaged by war. But in the post-war period, these quiet moments of humanity often went unspoken. The narrative of victory, of sacrifice, and of rebuilding the nation dominated the public discourse. There was little room for reflecting on the personal connections that had formed between soldiers and nurses during the war. In both the United States and Japan, the focus shifted quickly from the emotional toll of the war to the practicalities of rebuilding and moving forward. The soldiers who had once shared these rare moments of kindness with the nurses rarely spoke of them. The Japanese nurses, too, remained silent about their encounters with their American captors. Yet, in the years that followed, as veterans returned to their lives and as the world began to process the full impact of the war, the emotional significance of these encounters slowly emerged. The simple act of kindness that had occurred between soldiers and nurses, though fleeting, was a powerful reminder of the humanity that had survived the war. It was a reminder that, even in the most brutal of conflicts, there were moments where empathy, compassion, and kindness transcended the violence. This emotional shift, small but profound, highlighted the possibility for reconciliation, even in the aftermath of such destruction. The legacy of these moments, however small, carried weight. For the American soldiers, the memory of treating Japanese nurses with kindness became a symbol of what they had learned about the capacity for compassion in the face of war. For the nurses, the experience became part of their personal history, one that stood in stark contrast to the larger narrative of animosity and violence. While the aftermath of Okinawa and the Pacific War brought immense devastation, it also offered a glimpse of hope, one that proved, even in the most dire circumstances, the potential for humanity to endure. The Pacific War, with all its bloodshed, destruction, and relentless violence, ultimately left behind a world irrevocably changed. Cities were reduced to rubble, millions of lives were lost, and the scars of combat would linger for generations. But amid the devastation, there were moments, quiet, fleeting, and often overlooked, that offered a glimpse of something deeper within the human spirit. The encounters between American soldiers and Japanese nurses during the Battle of Okinawa, though brief, were a testament to the enduring potential for compassion, even in the darkest of times. In the midst of a brutal conflict that had pitted nations against each other, there was a shared humanity that could not be erased. For the soldiers, these moments of kindness were a reminder that, despite the hatred and dehumanization they had been taught to believe in, the enemy was not an abstract concept, but people who, like them, had suffered, bled, and hoped for the end of the war. For the nurses, the unexpected mercy extended to them shattered the long-held beliefs they had about their captors, showing them that even in war, there is room for humanity. These small acts of empathy did not alter the course of the war or change the strategic outcomes of battles. They did not heal the wounds of those who had been physically or emotionally scarred by the conflict, but they represented something much larger, a recognition that even in the most brutal of wars, humanity can still find a way to shine through the darkness. In a time when everything seemed to be defined by violence and destruction, these moments were a reminder that the potential for kindness exists in every person, regardless of nationality, ideology, or circumstance. The lasting impact of these brief encounters can be found in the stories told by those who lived through them. For the soldiers who extended kindness, these moments became a defining part of their experience. They were not simply men who had fought in a war. They were individuals who, in the midst of hatred, found a way to show compassion. For the nurses, the kindness of the American soldiers was a powerful reminder that even in the face of death and destruction, humanity could endure. As the years passed, and as both the United States and Japan rebuilt their nations, the memory of these encounters remained. They were a quiet, unspoken legacy of the war, a reminder that war, for all its horrors, does not define us. What defines us is our ability to recognize the humanity in others, even when it seems impossible. In the end, the story of the American soldiers and Japanese nurses serves as a poignant reflection on the nature of war and the strength of the human spirit. It is a reminder that, even in the darkest hours, we have the power to choose empathy over hatred, compassion over cruelty, and understanding over division. And though the war may have been won, the lessons of kindness learned in its midst are ones that continue to resonate, reminding us all that, Despite the horrors of war, there is always a chance for humanity to prevail.